here, but he is on live. He is in Honduras, and we are going to have a session, and he's going to do this live, teleconferencing. So if everything goes smooth, we should have no problems. That picture up there, that's him. And here is his PowerPoint, and we're going to walk through this. And after he's done with this session, we will have a time of question and answers. I'm going to walk around with this mic. So with your cooperation and with technology cooperation, everything should, and throw the board in there somewhere, everything should be smooth. Okay, go ahead, Dr. Wolterstorff.
All right. Thank you very much, Amit, and thank you all for being here. I'm very excited to do this. I'm a little bit nervous. I woke up about 4 in the morning, hoping that technology would cooperate and everything would go smoothly. I apologize for having to do it this way. As probably most of you know, there is a coup in Honduras, and at least for the last week or so, things seem to be getting a little bit worse as people get more desperate. And I was uncomfortable leaving my family in the middle of that stuff. And I hope that all of you be willing to continue to pray for the situation here. And I also hopefully this will just go as well as if I was there, but I miss hearing all the other speakers, and I was just looking again last night at the whole agenda, and it looks really interesting, so I hope I can get some of the talks and some of the papers later. I want to spend more time on the stuff that you have not yet seen, and less time on stuff you have, so I'm going to start out just quickly. I'm wondering how many of you have either heard or read already about my research, just my research in Honduras on short-term missions. And you can raise your hands and tell me about what percentage.
That looks like I'd say about 7 or 8%, maybe.
Okay, not many. All right, so I will start from the beginning and do my best to keep ourselves within the time limit. So let's go to the first slide. Amit?
Yep, you're on.
Next, there we go. So my initial research questions were, what is the impact of short-term missions? I got interested in this about 8 years ago. I had a sabbatical coming up, and I thought that short-term missions would be a very interesting topic. And I was interested in what the impact of short-term missions is, first of all, in the lives of short-termers, but also in the communities that they are visiting and working in, and thirdly, in the sponsoring organizations. Estimates are all over the map, but Bob Priest has estimated that about 2 million people went on short-term missions last year and spent about $3 billion. So the two sides of the debate are really, one group says lots of help is being done and lots of eyes are being opened. A small but vocal minority says that there is lots of dependency being created in these areas, and millions of dollars are being wasted. So those were the two sides, and I was interested, and I see lots and lots of groups coming down here to Honduras. We haven't really worked with many, but I see them all the time when we're working down here with Calvin College. And so today I'd like to look at 4 things. First of all, my research real briefly, then a review of short-term missions literature, a review of study abroad literature, and just a little bit on the goal-setting literature. So next slide. In my own research, which was published in Sociology in October 2006, I looked at the impact of short-term missions on North Americans and Hondurans. And Hurricane Mitch, some of you may remember, 1998, about 5,000 dead, 1.5 million people homeless or displaced. Hurricane Mitch was a Category 5 hurricane, same as Andrew in Miami. Andrew hit Miami for 6 hours. Hurricane Mitch hit Honduras for 6 days. So just incredible devastation. I'm using a pseudonym, but we'll call it CEDO. Our international organization here built over 1,000 homes after Hurricane Mitch. About 30 of those were built by volunteers. About 175 volunteers came down. And the rest were built by Christian NGOs. Honduran NGOs. So we had a nice study. We could look at what happened to the volunteers, but also what was the difference in the families. About 30 of the families had a house built by a group, and the other 970 had houses built by Christian NGOs. So was there a difference in the impact on those two groups of families and on the organizations that came? Next slide. So first of all, what was the impact on the Hondurans? We visited 6 different regions in Honduras, interviewed over 80 new homeowners. About half of those new homeowners had a house built by a group and about half by the Christian NGOs. And we also visited with about 15 employees of the 7 NGOs that built the houses. And what we found was, first of all, we were hoping to see, is there a difference between the families whose house was built by a group and the families whose house was built by an NGO? And we couldn't find any real difference. We talked to the families, we talked to the organizations. Everybody was super grateful for their houses. Everybody said, I'm never going to be the same. But we said, is there a difference between those two groups as far as spiritually, level of satisfaction with the house? Are they paying their loans back more or less? And from the pessimistic side, we would have said, well, if a group built the house, they're not going to pay it back. Or from the optimistic side, they're going to be more thankful. They're going to pay back more than if the Christian NGO did it. And we really couldn't find any difference. Next slide. But things weren't all the same. There was a lot of difference between NGOs. So there were 6 NGOs involved in this. 3 of the NGOs, the communities were very motivated. They were repaying. They were feeling excited, getting lots of training. The other 3 NGO communities, the other 3 NGOs communities had lots of problems. There was complaining, bickering. The houses weren't built well. They thought that they had been ripped off and that they hadn't given them all the materials they were supposed to. So I think that's good news, that the long-term strategies of the NGOs was powerful. And I'll come back to that in a little bit. And the last piece is I asked the families if you could choose, would you have a group come down or would you have them send the money? And basically their houses cost about $2,000. So a group usually spends about $20,000. So we said, would you rather have them come down and build 1 house or send the money and build 10? And I kind of thought that they would jump at that and say, well, no, we need 10 houses. It was much harder than I thought it would be for them to answer that question. And that was interesting. I think that shows they really do like, it's exciting, it's interesting, it's a chance to meet gringos. Those relationships are important, but in the end they said, there's so many people who need houses, we would have them send the money. But I think that also is interesting. Next slide. So in conclusion, what was the impact on Hondurans of these groups coming down? First of all, the house was very important, and I was also surprised by that. People said, I never thought I'd have a house, or after Hurricane Mitch destroyed my house, I never thought I'd get another one. But it wasn't important who built it. If it was built by a group or a Christian NGO, they were thankful to God, not to the NGO or to the group that came down. So it looks to me from that research that the value added by the group to the Honduran community, to the spiritual impact, etc., was minimal. But the NGO that was the group is there for a week. The NGO is there for several years, from before they built the house to building the house to following up on the training, etc. That was very important. And that Hondurans value the group, but if they choose, they would help more needy people. Next slide. So then, what's the impact on North Americans? First of all, we surveyed over 162 North Americans that came down. 127 of those responded, which is 78%. Very nice response rate. And the North Americans said that we want to know if they... Sorry, I have a phone ringing here. There we go. We wanted to know if the STM group led to lasting change. Were the STMers, the people who came down here, praying more, giving more money, volunteering more in their churches, etc.? We had 11 different factors. And on average, the answers were quite similar. About 16% of people said, oh yeah, I'm doing a lot more of that. 45% said, well, I'm doing a little bit, and 40% said they were the same. And in intangible areas like, do you care more about the poor, the numbers were a lot higher. But as far as were you giving money, things were lower. So let's go to the next slide. Here's a pie graph that's typical of what the answers look like. So we asked, did you give more money to CEDO after your trip? So about 9% said yes, significantly more. 43% said slight more, etc. So all of the pie charts looked quite similar. Next slide. So then we asked CEDO, we said, could you give us individual giving records, anonymized, for those 162 people? And we said, let's look at what those numbers look like. So 9% said their giving increased significantly and 43% said somewhat. But when we went to the actual records, only 25% of the people who went ever gave a direct donation. 14 of those were new donors, but 10 people who had given donations before coming to Honduras didn't give anyone after again. And if we averaged all of the giving, it went up from $31 per person to $33 per person per year. Or the total went from 5,076 to 5,386. So after going to Honduras, after spending a week to 2 weeks of their year there, the giving only went up $300 amongst those 162 people. So very disappointing, I'm sure, for CEDO and even for me in my research. I thought, wow, it doesn't look like that changed their lives much if those 162 people altogether only gave an extra $300 at the end of the year. But then somebody said, well, maybe they didn't send a direct donation, they put it in a collection plate. So we looked at the 17 sending churches, and we said, what had happened to their CEDO giving the 2 years before and the 2 years after? Of those 17, 7 increased, 10 actually went down, and the average only went up 1%. So people said they gave a lot more or a little more, most people, over 50%, but in the end, it didn't seem very true, which makes you also wonder, they say they're praying more, volunteering more, etc., and you wonder if that's true. So, next slide. We also had a few open-ended questions, and I'll just mention those real briefly. And the things that people answered most commonly in those about, how they were changed. One was, they said they were much more aware of poverty. The third thing on the list, this is in order of priority, how often it was mentioned. They said they were more conscious of the world. So when they watched TV, the news, etc., they'd say, I know what poverty looks like now. They also would say, I was surprised because Hondurans were so poor, but they were so happy. And I'm going to come back to that. But that was the second most common response. And the fourth most common was how important the relationships were that people had. And 24% of people said that they were staying in touch with people, which I think is extremely exaggerated. My guess is it's probably around 1% from my own experience in talking to people. So what do we have about conclusions about North Americans? First of all, self-perception of change was very big. People thought they had changed, or at least reported changing a lot. But as far as giving goes, self-perception was wrong, and giving did not increase. And that at least questions whether the lasting impact was big or minimal. And it also brings up some questions. First of all, why wasn't there more lasting change? But when my research originally came out, a lot of people said, it's just this one study. Too bad, you either screwed it up, Kurt, or else this is an exception, because we know in our experience with short-term missions that there is lasting change. So that led to my next phase of research, and the next slide. So I decided to look over short-term missions literature in general, and I tried to find all the studies out there on short-term missions. I found over 60 qualitative studies, so studies that were going out there and saying, what did you think of short-term missions? How was your experience? All 60 of those were very positive. Open-ended interviews, long-term interviews. But when we went to quantitative studies, there were 33 that were self-reporting studies. So are you praying more? Are you giving more? Are you doing this? Again, all very positive. So it's clear that people feel and think like this is a very positive experience and it's lasting. But I found 12 studies using independent verification, so a pre-test and a post-test or some sort of secondary data. Next slide. Of those 12 studies, 10 found very little to no significant change in participants. So 10 basically backed up my own research. And I'll just cite 2 of those, and if you want to look in Bob Priest's book that came out, there's a chapter that I wrote that summarizes all of this. So Bob Priest did a study of 685 Christians, and I like this methodology. His hypothesis is that the more short-term missions trips people have gone on, we should see they are donating more money, they're less materialistic, and they should have more inter-ethnic relationships. So if they like Mexicans in Mexico, they ought to like Mexicans in Chicago. But when you looked at these 685 Christians, there was no relationship to how many short-term missions trips they had taken and these other 3 factors. So people who had gone on lots of short-term missions trips were not donating more, were not less materialistic, and did not have more inter-ethnic friendships. So no positive relationship. Next slide. This is my favorite study, a study by Purvis in 1993. There we go. And excellent methodology, better methodology than I had. He looked at 79 short-term volunteers and 68 respondents, so very nice response rate. He did a pre and a post-test and a 6-month after test. No control group. There were 38 churches in Kentucky who were visiting Kenya over 12 years. So he had these nice group of churches. They had a newsletter, they had a paid volunteer coordinator, and their self-reporting, just like all the other tests, were super positive. They were praying more, they were more knowledgeable about missions, etc. And 76% claimed that their missions giving had increased greatly or some. So even higher than mine. My rate was 50-some% claimed an increase, and he had 76. So he said missions giving is going up. But then he went and looked at the 11 years of giving records from those churches to missions. And he ended up finding, first of all, that there was no relationship between short-term missions and church growth. So he had 2 hypotheses. One is churches that use more short-term missions will grow more and also will give more to missions. So his first hypothesis, he said, there was no support for it. Churches that did more short-term missions weren't growing faster. But his second thing he found to be true. There was almost a 70% increase in missions giving over those 12 years. But as I looked at his data, I looked to see if he had adjusted for inflation, and I emailed him if he had, and he said he hadn't. So after I adjusted the data for inflation, and you guys probably all know in the 80s there was lots of inflation, there was only a 7% increase in missions giving over those 11 years, less than a 1% increase per year in giving. So basically, giving was flat for missions. And they actually started taking half of all the short-term missions expenses out of the missions funds. So the amount of money actually going to missions, or to long-term missions at least, went down probably dramatically. And Purvis has confirmed those findings. So next step. I did find 2 short-term mission studies that did find positive change, and there's a couple interesting things here that I want you to know. First of all, Hopkins looked at 64 university students. They did 5 weeks in North America, did a very nice methodology, a little bit of a small group, but he was looking at global responsibility, and there was significant positive change. Jones did high school students, 2-month short-term missions, again in North America, on faith maturity and self-concept. There was no change in self-esteem, but there was significant change in spiritual maturity. So what's interesting about these, both of these are in North America, and they're longer, not just a week or 2. So they're 5 weeks and 2 months and in North America. So the only 2 short-term missions trips, which did have significant change, had something different about them. And the other 10 of 12 did confirm my own study. So as far as the original critiques about, my study was off base because it was just in Honduras or just this or just that, the other short-term missions literature, which is quantitative, supported my own research, at least the majority of it. But I was still interested in the topic, so next slide. I ended up deciding to look at study abroad, which is my job with Calvin College. I run semesters abroad here in Honduras for students studying poverty and development. And I thought, wow, if short-term missions looks to me like it's having little long-term results, what about what I'm dedicating my life to? Because study abroad is not all that different than short-term missions. So as far as similarities go, it's a short time in another culture, but it's focused on learning, not doing, so it's a little bit different. But when I go to the qualitative studies, again, hundreds of them, but all very positive. When I go to the quantitative studies, there's again a bunch of self-reporting, were you changed by your semester? Yes, I was. Qualify it from 1 to 5, it was a 4. But there were 22 studies, again, that used some sort of independent verification, a pre-test and post-test, a post-test with control group, secondary data, etc. Next slide. I'm going to look at one of each of the groups. So I found 6 of the 22 found significant positive change. So this study from 2004, 232 subjects, 6 weeks in Europe, and did a cross-cultural test and a study abroad goals scale, and they found significant change. So 6 of the 22 studies were significantly positive. Second slide. Another 6 of the 22 showed either mixed or weak, and I throw stuff in here fairly liberally because I don't want to be accused of trying to bias things. So things sometimes were very weak, but I would still throw it in here. So this study, 100 students from the University of Georgia, there was no significant increase in either experimental or control groups in self-esteem and world-mindedness. But 4 of the 10 subscales within one of the areas did show change. So she thought that as far as world-mindedness and self-esteem, the students who went abroad would increase. That neither of those things were true, but within the one of the scales, there were 4 subscales that did show positive change. And then the next slide, the last study I'd like you to pay a little more attention to again. So there were 10 of the 22, so we have 6 very mixed to weak and 10 with no change. So that's 16 of 22 with very little to no change after studying study abroad semester. So study by Workman, I think this is interesting. Pennsylvania State found there was no difference in the mean pre-test and post-test for those who studied abroad. But what's interesting is she breaks this study down, and I think this would be interesting for short-term missions and for study abroad and lots of other things. Students who scored high on the pre-test showed a decrease in openness to diversity after going abroad. There was no change in the middle group, and students who scored on the lowest showed an increase regardless of whether they went abroad or not. So let me try and explain that a little bit. She has a group that went to Germany, and she has a group which stayed in the US. So she gives them a pre-test and a post-test, and she says, how open are you to diversity? So on the group who was very, very open before they went, they actually decreased. And the group that was in the middle showed no change, and the group that was not very open to people of different cultures, when they came back, they were a lot more open. But even the students who were at the Pennsylvania State also increased the same amount. Next slide. So in the next slide, I want to focus on the second half of this slide first. So what this author is saying, and I think what needs to get some more research, is student abroad participants say they're going to Germany. And before they go, they say, oh, I just love other cultures, and I love Germans, and this is going to be so interesting. But then they get there, and they live with a German family, and the German men are very nice to the little North American college student girls. And all of a sudden, things are a little discouraging, and not so easy, and a lot more complex. and they may lose some self-esteem. They don't see themselves quite as positively as they did as North Americans, as college students, etc. But the groups that were at the bottom end actually see increases because they go with an idea, I don't like Germany, I don't really want to go, but I have to get my credits. But then they go and they say, yeah, that wasn't so bad. So I'm wondering how that applies, and it may explain some of the reasons why we're seeing no change in people. That how people go into things may have a lot to do with what we see at the end. So that's one thing to think about. The other thing about this is that several studies found that situations where people are in the most similar setting, they end up seeing more change. And when they're in the most different situations, people feel out of their comfort zone and change is less likely. So England versus Africa. So there's semesters abroad in England, which seem to show much more positive and lasting change in people versus semesters in Africa, where maybe people are overwhelmed, it's difficult to see how to apply this to your life, you feel different, people are staring at you all the time, which may also explain why the short-term missions trips, which were done in North America, showed more positive change than the ones that went overseas. So, again, something to think about. So, summing up here, there's still very mixed results going to the top of this slide. And there may be that, but it's still more positive than short-term missions. It may be because it's longer, usually it's a semester abroad, 4 months versus a week. Maybe because it's focused on learning, and so students are going in with a different attitude than short-term missions people. I like to think it's because professors are involved and somehow a PhD influences things, but I doubt that's true. It may be because they're usually doing language and culture study, maybe because more similar settings. Again, lots of ideas for continued research. Next slide. So, some other things to continue thinking about for research. Why is there this difference between qualitative and quantitative studies? Is it that people are just lying and saying that they've really changed and they haven't? Or is there something going on, but it's hard for us to get at? So that's, I think, a continuing question. Why is study abroad better than short-term missions? What can short-term missions learn from study abroad? And also, I think there's a huge need for lots more research on the host, both in short-term missions and study abroad, the people who receive short-term missions. So, if any of you are doing research, good questions to think about. Next slide. Just want to talk a little bit about an issue that I have here with this idea that Hondurans are poor and happy. First of all, I question whether or not it's true. Because you visit a community that's very poor and they smile and they laugh and they offer you a Coca-Cola, does that mean they're happy? And I know that if Calvin College just canceled my semester here because of the coup, I'm not sure I'm going to get paid, but let's say I even got fired and you guys, one of you came over to visit, I'm still going to be friendly, I'll be happy, I'll offer you a Coke. But when you leave my house, I may go up to bed and not get out for the rest of the day. So saying that people are poor and happy, there's questions whether or not we can even judge that just based on a superficial visit that with people we don't understand their language or their culture. But even if it is true, what does this statement mean? Does it mean that they're so poor and happy, so I should be less materialistic and I would be happy? And that, if that's true, I would be content with it, I guess. But, or is it also that they're so poor and happy, so I'm rich and I'm unhappy, so I really don't need to do anything for them. In fact, I might as well just, I should be more like them, and they're lucky. So I wish I was poor, but I'm not, and you get the idea. The final question, though, there is short-term missions really seeing the lives of the poor? Are short-term mission groups with a week or two and coming back and saying, oh, they're so poor and they're happy, Are they really even getting a glimpse of what's going on there, of families who can't afford to send their kids to school or can't afford to eat? Next slide. So some conclusions. First of all, the vast majority of studies, both of short-term missions and study abroad, do not show lasting results. And so what isn't working? We're spending billions of dollars on both short-term missions and on study abroad. And I think what we know is that change is difficult. Change is difficult for us, change is difficult for Hondurans, and I'm just going to talk about Hondurans to make this easier. But put in the country you choose. And I used to think that Honduran communities were fragile and that North Americans were impressionable. And but I think we know that that's really not very true. Change is difficult. 1 week seldom changes us or anybody else. And we may want to exercise more, we want to pray more, we want to get rid of some of our bad habits, we may want to start good habits. All of those things are difficult, and hardly ever does it change just because of a weekend retreat or a week of something. Next slide. So here's where I draw my title, and I can't profess to have gone too deep into this yet, but I've begun thinking about the parable of the sower. And in short-term missions context, we usually would think that the people who are going, whether they're gringos or Canadians or Europeans or Peruvians, are the sowers, and that the people who will receive us are the soil. And I think we also would think that there's some special seed that we are giving them that's only good for them. And, you know, like the mango tree grows in the South. You plant a mango tree in Chicago or Michigan, you're never going to get mangoes. So we're the soil, we're the sowers, they're the soil, and there's a special seed that's only good for them. But as I rethink this, I wonder, like, to God, who really is the sower? Are we the sower, or are they the sower? Or is the Holy Spirit the sower? Or are all three of those true? And also, who's the soil? Are they the soil, or are we the soil, or are both of us the soil? And that brings up the question, who is this for? Is this for us? And usually we don't think of short-term missions being for us. But if it's for both of us, then we also need to prepare our hearts, our soil, and need to be nurtured and pruned. And also, what is the seed? Is it a mango seed, which is only good in tropical climates? Is it an apple seed, which is only good in Chicago and Michigan? Or is it something more like corn, which grows, I think, everywhere, at least in Central America and North America? You can grow corn anywhere. And I love the David Bosch Transforming Mission. He's written this in several different places. But to evangelize is to take 2 risks. 1, that they will be changed, and that this will almost always be uncomfortable for us in the ways that they change and challenge us, but also that I will be changed. And I think that we need to start thinking about short-term missions differently, and using the parable of the sower, that we are both sower and soil, and the seed is for both them and for us. And in the end, it's the Holy Spirit that is doing most of the work. A couple more quick things. Next slide, thanks. So the goal-setting research, Locke and Latham, there's a lot of stuff out there. If some of you want to read some more, I can send you some more links. But for 35 years, they've been doing research on goal setting. And they have found that there are 3 things that are important in goal setting. First of all, preparation, but then encouragement and accountability. So before you try and achieve your goals, you need specific and challenging but achievable goals. So, and I think we've all heard this stuff, right? And also, self-set goals are better than someone else setting the goals. But once you have these goals, you need encouragement and accountability. It's better if the goals are public, that everybody else knows what your goals are, and that you get feedback that's regular and clear. And I love this quote in this Locke and Latham article. The effects of goal setting are very reliable. If we set goals like this for anybody, we know what's going to happen. They're going to be much more likely to achieve them. Next slide. So, If we want fruit, if we want lasting change, we need the right soil, the right nurturing, the right pruning. So I think it's preparation, encouragement, accountability. We know that change is difficult. It's difficult to start exercising. It's difficult for starting doing devotions. It's difficult to improve my marriage. We can want to do that, but first of all, we have to prepare ourselves that this is for us, that we want to change. And then we need encouragement and accountability. It's easier if we do it with someone else, not by ourselves. If we have regular meetings, if there's reporting, if there's feedback. Next slide. So, if we want to see lasting change in North Americans, and I would argue this is essential, short-term missions is not just for Hondurans, it's for North Americans. If we want to see these changes, what do we need to do? It's important, maybe not so, but what we do before and after. But especially before, we need to focus on that this is for all of us, and we need to set goals. That we're going to pray when we come back. We're going to evangelize when we come back. We're going to educate. If we can get 20 participants to raise $5,000 a year for 10 years, we've raised $1 million for that mission effort. We also need a little prep beforehand to make sure we're sensitive and to kind of learn all we can to open our eyes. But I think it's not so, it's very little about what we do while we're there or before, and it's much more about what we do when we come back. The North Americans and the hosts need to set goals for what they're going to do afterwards. And we need to set up monthly meetings and newsletters and information sharing between the North, how are you guys doing in the States? Are you accomplishing your goals? Yeah, we are. How are you doing in Honduras? Are you accomplishing your goals? So not only within groups of their accountability, but also between groups. Next slide. Secondly, if we want to see lasting change in Hondurans and the receivers, it isn't about the 1 week. It's about picking excellent partners. And I think this is way underappreciated. It's the host which will make or break the experience. And I often use the example. If my daughter, who's 16, becomes anorexic, I do not want a group of high school students trying to help her figure out. She could die from that. I want the best psychiatrist, psychologist working with her who has experience in this. But if we have kids with AIDS or some other serious problem in Africa, and we send a bunch of high school students, they can be a little piece, but it's the partner we have chosen that is key. So if I'm going to spend $50,000, I need to think, how am I going to invest this well? Who's going to do the good work before I'm there and after I leave? I could screw it all up. I could have crappy training. My week there could be a disaster. But if there's somebody really excellent on the other end, they're going to make it turn out good. And the opposite, if I'm super prepared and I do an excellent job for that week, but the missionary or the organization I partner with is just crappy, it's all going to turn out crappy. So we need to do the research about who's doing the good work and who we're going to partner with. And last of all, for missionaries, for organizations, if you want to see increased support from short-term missions, CEDO is a great example of how it isn't going to just happen. Just bringing people to Honduras to build houses, they're not going to send you the money. It requires follow-up, it requires hard work, it requires encouragement, meetings, newsletters, etc., to keep people engaged. So my last slide. I am not anti-short-term missions. Next slide there, sorry. I am not anti-short-term missions. I'm not anti-study abroad, since that's my work. But I am pessimistic about the way, in some ways, even I'm doing study abroad and lots of people are doing short-term missions. Because I think it's way too much focus on getting prepared and what we do while we're there. But this is not an effective or efficient way to build houses, or to evangelize, or to do painting of a building. But I am optimistic that if we make short-term missions more about the lasting change, about what happens afterwards, that these short-term mission trips could become a catalyst for all sorts of lasting change. And if that was true, if short-term missions became about learning something while they're in Honduras that will change their lives forever, that will get them praying, etc., that will be the difference. So I think that short-term missions is evidence that North Americans want to change. They want to change others and they want to change themselves. That they want to be the sower, but they also are willing to be the soil. And that the seed is not just for them, but it's for us too. So that's the end. And I think we have 5 minutes for questions.
Okay, can you hear us, Dr. Beek?
I can hear you.
Okay. Questions? Yeah.
Can you comment a little bit on longer-term studies that have gone on? Here's the reason why I ask that. As a high school student, when I come back to the States, I have a lot of other pressures and things that are going on. I'm thinking about college, family, et cetera, 20 or 30 years later, I might be faced with a life choice that is very much influenced by the fact that I was exposed to a short-term mission trip. It might build confidence. It might have given me the ability to make a life decision that will change my life. What do we know about that, about how short-term missions affects much, much longer-term decisions in life for benefit?
I think that's a good question, and I think it's just an extremely hard question to suss out in research. Like, how much did your grade school teacher influence where you are now? You know, that third grade teacher who you just loved. How do you figure out when you're 45 what the influence of that third grade teacher is? And I think sometimes, at least, I'm not sure if you are, but that the question has an agenda which says, wait a minute, I know that this short-term missions research is faulty because sooner or later it's going to influence people, and I know that that's true. And I think that that's accurate. I think that in small and sometimes not so small ways, those short-term missions trips may show changes 5 years, 10 years, 30 years difference. But my point would be, but we can make it a lot more than that. We can make short-term missions change people a lot and sooner. And if that's true, then why don't we do it? So I think that if we do a prayer retreat for a weekend in some camp with teenagers, and then they all decide that they're going to start praying regularly, but then we don't set up any structures for encouraging that and making that happen, I think we've failed them. And maybe 10 or 20 years later, they'll remember that retreat and start praying. But why didn't we help them when they were high school to start doing the praying? So I think you're right that happens, but I think that we are failing by not helping it happen more and sooner. That's all I was going to say.
Kurt, I agree that the trip should be both for the travelers and the hosts. But would you say that would be a 50-50 equal benefit, or would you think that maybe the priority should go with the hosts? So those going should look at the hosts as being the priority. With Paul was undoubtedly blessed by his mission activities himself, but would not his focus have been on the blessing that he was able to facilitate where he went?
I guess I would sort of frame the question, who would God more rather see transformed? And I think if you ask the question that way, God wants to see all of us transformed. God wants to see all our lives changed. And so God wants to see Hondurans transformed, and that this experience, which is very costly on all sides, would change Hondurans forever. But God also wants to see these North American high school students change and transform forever. So I I don't think that God has a preference. I think again, I think it goes back to this idea that somehow we're more the sowers and they're more the soil. And I'm uncomfortable with that. I think we're both the sowers and we're both the soil, and God wants to use these experiences to change all of us. And so, if you want to do the numbers, I'd say 50-50. But God wants to see us all changed.
Okay, Dr. Beek, we're out of time, unfortunately, so we're going to have to cut it off at that point.
Okay.
Thanks a lot.
Out there at the conference, and I would be happy if any of you want to email me or set up a Skype call or something yet this weekend or anytime in the future. So thank you very much for your time.
Bye-bye.
What's his email?
It's on the next slide, but it's also kverbeek@kelvin.edu.